Tony, I appreciate you joining us. We're really getting a chance to look back on individuals like yourself to look at the history of echo and the history of the Society of Echo. How did you first become interested in echo, and what do you remember about that?
Well, I was a first-year fellow at UC Davis, and my chief, Dean Mason, he called me in one day and he said, "I've got this new machine, a radar chymogram, and it tracks the heart border on fluoroscopy." He said, "And that's going to be your project." So I worked with that sucker for 6 months, and I was getting nowhere. And I went to a national meeting, and I see that they had an evening session on non-invasive techniques, including ultrasound to track the inside of the heart. And so I went to it, and at that meeting, I think it was American Heart, in the whole meeting, it was one evening session where echo was part of it, and Harvey was on the program, and he was talking about things. And I went back and I said to my chief, I think there's a better way to do this than this radar chymogram. And as fate had it, one of my best friends from medical residency was doing a fellowship, cardiology fellowship at Indiana. So I said to my chief, if I could, I can stay with him. I'd like to go to Indiana and learn about that. And he agreed. He told me, he said, I think you're wasting your time. He said, I can tell how bad a pericardial effusion is without doing that stuff. But off I went, and I was one of Harvey's one-week wonders. Right. And I came back. It's kind of an interesting story. And I go to the chief again, and I said, listen, I think we got something here. I think we can evaluate the left ventricle and whatnot. And he said, well, all right. He said, I've just been approached by a drug company to do a drug study. If you do the drug study for me, I'll take some of the money and buy an echo machine. At that time, a SmithKline M-mode echo cost $10,000.
Goodness.
And that's how we started.
So were you still a fellow then when you were, when you were doing the...
Absolutely.
And you were doing the echoes yourself, right?
I was getting the patients myself. I'd go get, because nobody really, at the time, Bob Krause, Rich Pop, and myself really had the only echo machines. And then David San, who was behind me, right, got an echo machine. But in the whole state of California, that's all that was going on. It's another interesting story, because I used to go get the patients and bring them down, and we had just gotten an E4M recorder. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, you put your face in and take Polaroids, and I actually was allergic to the rubber, so I went around with a rash on my face half the time. So, but for the E4M recorder, you'd have to pour in the developing fluid, and it was hot as hell, and you were burning your hands. And so one day the chief is making rounds in the CCU. He sees a patient, this woman, she's admitted for the third time in a month. And in fact, she has recurrent chest pain, severe mitral regurg, and an ugly looking ECG, but she never infarcts. And so the chief goes over, it's a very unusual case of coronary disease and whatnot. I said, mitral regurg, I haven't seen one of those. So I go do the echocardiogram, and of course she's got hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And the next day on chief's rounds, I say, what she actually has is this. And his jaw dropped, and from then on, he never saw another patient on rounds that didn't get an echo first.
That's phenomenal. So you were doing the M-mode echo, and how did you get introduced to 2D echo? And what did you think about that?
So, we were all so lucky. I got to make so many easy observations, because when I went for my 1 week with Harvey, in between patient examinations, he had the accumulated world literature on echocardiography at that time, and it fit in one loose leaf binder. Really, you could, and half of the loose leaf binder was this seminar in symposium in Acta Medica Scandinavia. So I had read every single paper ever written in any language on cardiac ultrasound, and so I had the good fortune of getting some visibility in ultrasound.
Sure.
And so when companies started developing 2Ds, they'd come to our lab or often ask me what I thought. And actually, my first involvement was with Grumman, the old Grumman, and at the time it was a battle between Varian and Grumman, who was going to win. And we at Duke and at the time UC Davis, where I was, we were the Grumman sites, and Grumman placed the machine with us, and we were off and running and doing 2D. And of course, Harvey was still with the Broxodon toothbrush, the mechanical scanner.
It's interesting to me because you have I've had the pleasure of doing a bunch of these interviews, and almost all of the early users of echo have all commented about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is interesting because it had such a polarizing debate, I guess, about what it was and what caused it. But when 2D echo came along, what did you think, and how did you apply it?
Randy, it's interesting. Looking back on it, I really think that all of us who did ultrasound shared one characteristic, and that was the arrogance to think that we could go ahead and do something that hadn't been done before. I mean, now every fellow who comes along needs a mentor, but there were no mentors. Harvey was doing 2D for the first time himself, so none of us knew anything. Nelson Schiller plunks a transducer on the apex just to see what would happen, and he came up with what he thought was the short axis of the apex, and then ultimately we figured out it was the four-chamber view. And all of a sudden we could see the right ventricle, we could see the atria, and a whole new world opened up: cardiac masses and regional function, and it was just extraordinary. So it started all over again, and those of us who had the opportunity to get the low-hanging fruit with M-mode,
right,
were there again. I mean, my first paper on 2D, I think, was on LV thrombi, because nobody'd seen apical thrombi before. Right. Aortic aneurysms, and we taught ourselves. We really taught ourselves. You'd have a patient who was diagnosed or whatnot with cath, the available techniques. You do the echo and say, this is what the echo looks like in this condition. So it was a blast. And same thing, Doppler. I had actually become involved with the earliest Dopplers from Seattle, and that was an M-mode Doppler, and it really was much more difficult to do, much more difficult to figure out. Once you coupled 2D with Doppler, man, you were off and running.
It's interesting to me that if we look at, and I'll ask you in a second about this, but you look at where the field's come, not only in technology but in application, who does it, et cetera, et cetera. When you started, and then when you were a young faculty member doing this, you were doing a lot of these studies yourself, and then along came the concept of sonographers. Rich has talked about Kitty Philly and others. Where do you see the role of sonographers in the evolution of ultrasound, of echo? You understand what I'm saying?
Sure,
I think
sure.
It's an interesting.
Well, my first sonographer was a man named Alex Newman, who actually went on to considerable acclaim. Alex was one of the great sonographers, and he actually had a master's degree in neurophysiology and was working in the cath lab. And in those early days, I mean, we were a team. We'd do clinical studies all day long, then we'd go home at night and together do the measurements and write the papers and stuff like that. And Alex really added enormously, since he, was on his way to completing his PhD. He taught me a lot of things about scientific methods that I didn't pick up in medical school. He also was ingenious in terms of, we had a card system, one of those old card systems, and he'd punch out a hole depending upon what the patient had. And so after a couple of years, you just put a sewing needle in through the hole you were interested in, and all the cards that fell out, they were the patients that had it. And Alex was great at doing that. And then our second technician was Oiling Kwan, and she's been with me for 30 years at Davis in Kentucky, and now San Diego. And Oiling was one of the earliest leaders of the Sonography Council of the ASE, and sonographers in echocardiography have always been unique in their contributions, not only to performing the study, but in research and innovation. I think in ultrasound we're really unique in that regard. If you look at the cath lab or the EP lab, those technologists are very skilled, but they have a confined kind of contribution, whereas in ultrasound, the sonographers really are, in every sense of the word, partners.
That's great, because that's what has been my assumption. Tony, you've obviously had a tremendous career with not only what you've done in echo, but in cardiology in general with the ACC, and now as being editor of JAC. As you look back, though, on the developments, let's say, in echo, with the newest technologies and the old technologies, what do you think is the impact of echo? What's been its impact in our practice of cardiology?
Oh, it's echo has really almost become part of the physical examination of the cardiac patient. In the early days it was who needed an M-mode echo, and then who needed a 2D echo, and who needed a Doppler exam. But now, patient has cardiac disease. It's the history, the physical, the EKG, and the echo. So, and with these new small devices that you can carry in your pocket, cardiac ultrasound really is an essential part of the evaluation of any patient.
You were the 5th president of the American Society of Echo. How did you get active in the American Society of Echo, and what, if you can remember back that far, if you can remember last night, can you remember, how did you get active in the American Society of Echo?
So I was one of Harvey Feigenbaum's one-week wonders. I went back to California. I wrote my first paper on mitral valve prolapse. So when Harvey organized this meeting, he organized the first big meeting in Indianapolis. And it was just supposed to be an educational meeting as far as we knew, but of course he had in the back of his mind to start the American Society of Echo. And so I was on the faculty. I was on the faculty of that meeting, and we all agreed we ought to have a society. And Jim Dillon took up the policies and procedures. And as I recall, I was the second treasurer of this organization. Now, there wasn't much to treasure, As I recall, anybody who wanted to join could join, and I think it's $25 to be a member or something like that. And we didn't spend hardly any money. And So the first year they said, well, you have to file a tax report. We collected a couple $1,000. We didn't spend anything, but anyway. So I was the treasurer, and then I was on the nominations committee, and I think Provenchal was the chairman of the nominations committee. And he said, there was some talk that I should withdraw from the nominations committee to be a candidate, but I didn't. And I think we nominated that time Joe Kislow. And then subsequently, I was fortunate enough to be nominated after Joe. Now, I worried about that a little bit because Joe Kislow is such a detail-oriented person. He threw himself into the job.
Literally.
Yeah. Most of us were career building in different ways, but for Joe, this was it. So following him was a little bit daunting, but it was at a time where we were defining what was a sonographer and trying to determine how important it was to get the RCDMS. And it was actually, when I was president, one of the initiatives, one of the gifts I left to the ASE was the journal. Now,
so you started the journal?
Okay, so...
tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so at the time you served as president for 2 years. And actually when I was treasurer, I was appointed treasurer, and so we had our first executive meeting. It was at a meeting at the American Heart Association in San Francisco. And we got together in this small delicatessen. Walter, myself, I forget who else was there. And in those days, there would be a board meeting at the national meetings for a couple of hours, and that was it. So, we were beginning. What Joe gave us was he gave us organization, Olson Management.
Right.
Up until that point, we had. So then we had Olson Management and Sharon Perry, and we were coming together as a group. And I was approached by Futura Publications, and they had a journal called Echocardiography published by Navananda. And they said, what would you think about making echocardiography the official journal of the American Society of Echo? And, it looked like a pretty attractive thing, to a ready-made journal. But at the time, I was writing a book with one of the other publishers, and so I mentioned to that publisher that we were thinking of having a journal. I said, you should go with us. It was Mosby. They were in St. Louis.
Right.
And so I started thinking, should we have a journal? And if we should we just adopt this one? And the final meeting of my presidency, we came and brought it up and presented to the board and said, we should have a journal. That's my proposal. And that of the various things, I think we should go with a brand new journal, own it ourselves, appoint the editor ourselves and everything. And the board voted in favor of that. And so, we had all agreed there would be a journal. And the only question was management and whatnot. And then subsequently, Al Parisi was given the task of locating an editor. I was involved with that, and that was a slam dunk. Who else but Harvey Fagman? Wasn't even an issue. So we agreed to that in about 10 milliseconds, and the journal ultimately was implemented.
That's fascinating. I'm sure I've heard that, but I couldn't remember it. As you think, and obviously you've had tremendous contributions to the field in general. As you look back, thinking about where it's come from, what do you see as the future of echo in this complex medical system that we're in and entering?
So, I see echocardiography evolving along the lines of electrocardiography. Truthfully, there's not an American Society of Electrocardiography. Mm-hmm. It's such a part and parcel of medicine, mm-hmm. not just cardiology, but medicine, that we kind of take it for granted. Now, there will always be developments in ultrasound. I think the technology, I continue to believe that ultimately the contrast agents will be perfected. Right. I've seen it be applied effectively in animals, and it's just a matter of time until it happens in human beings, and there will be better instruments and whatnot. But with the advent of these small devices, I see this being not just for cardiology, internal medicine, emergency medicine, and as the future goes on, everybody will just, echocardiography, it's like the electrocardiogram. It's basic information. Everybody uses it, and it probably will be harder and harder to make the huge leaps that have occurred in the time I've been involved, M mode to 2D to Doppler to 3D, etc. I think echo will just be so incorporated into the medical armamentarium that it'll be taken for granted a little bit.
Final thing, and I think you're probably right. The final thing I'd ask you is that, we've recently had a chance to get all of the past presidents together, as we do on an annual basis. But as you look back over not only your professional sort of life in echo, but your personal relationship with your colleagues in echo and the presidents of the society or others in the society, the sonographers, what strikes you?
The echo group was unique in a number of respects. Since cardiac ultrasound really was developed in the late 60s, as I say, I took it up as a fellow, and none of my professors knew anything about ultrasound. I was teaching them rather than vice versa, so all of us were very young. I mean, we were experts 2 or 3 years after our fellowship, instant experts. Right. You know what they say, on the island of the blind, the man with one eye is king. And so it was unique that all of us were about the same age, were relatively young, and were building our careers together. Not just our careers, but our families, mm-hmm. And we became very tightly bound because we were experiencing the same thing. We were picking schools for our children and trying to advance academically and trying to do a little research. And we had the added attribute of all of these consulting positions. So as you know, Randy, a couple times a year we'd go on some kind of a retreat to consult for one company or the other. Of course, you probably couldn't do that in this day and age, no. but we did it then. And so we would even vacation together. And between lecturing at each other's institutions and sharing the family issues together in these consulting vacations, we really bonded in ultrasound in a way that I think was unique, that I didn't witness in the other disciplines. I didn't see the cath people or the electrophysiology people, et cetera, being so close together in terms of their family and extra medical issues. And that's maintained to this time. Perhaps it lasted a little bit too long because we were young. Then, you know, we didn't kind of fade out. In the other areas of cardiology, people would be very active, assume leadership positions, and then go on. Whereas in echocardiography, and look at, we're still around. I mean, you know, 30 years later, and people saying, get out of the way, let the young people in there. And I think we have. I think that's really good. But I can remember that all of us, I mean, Harvey, myself, Joe, would attend every ASE board meeting for probably the first 10 or 15 years. We were still running the organization in effect, and now it's mature and vibrant and whatnot. But going back to your initial question, you know, my best friends were usually not the people I worked with at my given institution. They were the echo people at other institutions that I had come to know so well and share experiences with so well. And that's a precious benefit of cardiac ultrasound.
Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for, you know, you've made tremendous contributions. We appreciate it.
Sure.